Oh, you mentioned the leadership and going all the way to the top, that the corruption has gone that far and that they cover to maintain this facade. I mean, so they're really not trustworthy, are they? I mean, and then it's not just Filet probably either. I don't know how much you know about the others, but yeah, it's you can't just point to one person and be like, oh, it's just him.
No, it's not. I mean, I encourage people to go and either watch or read. I've written many articles on this as well, on some of the cases exposing Bishop Bernard Filet. But Schmidberger was also complicit in the case of Father Philippe Peignot. Now, Father Philippe Peignot, for those of you who may be familiar with the case of Vincent Lambert in France, I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but he was the famous quadriplegic. And there was a huge debate in France over the end of life. Oh, yeah. Vincent Lambert was a quadriplegic. They called him in a persistent vegetative state, but he responded to his parents. He responded, he wasn't a vegetable. And yet, I believe it was his wife who wanted to just basically let him die, starve him to death. So there was this huge debate in France over the case of Vincent Lambert. Unfortunately, tragically, he was allowed to die. So the culture of death won in that case. But the genesis of Vincent Lambert's condition had to do with abuse that he suffered by Father Philippe Peignot, SSPX priest. Father Peignot admitted to abusing Lambert when Lambert was a child. Lambert then turned to drugs and alcohol, which almost always happens with abuse victims. They turn to drugs and alcohol to medicate the pain. And it was because he was drunk and riding on a motorcycle, he got into this huge crash and ended up being a quadriplegic. But you can pretty much lay the blame at the feet of Father Peignot, SSPX priest. He also abused a number of other boys in France. This was known to the leadership. Father Schmidberger knew. And for a little while, they placed some restrictions on him. He was made to go do like a year of prayer and penance at Lourdes. There's a SSPX house at Lourdes. But then he was put right back in a parish with free access to children. And guess what he did after that? He abused another child. And that's the one that I exposed in one of my spotlights. And then Bishop Filet comes into power. He knows all about the past, about Peignot and all of that. He also, a second time, lifts the ban on Peignot. And this is all documented. This is not rumor, conjecture. This is all documented. There is correspondence. There's an audio tape. There's like an audio tape of Father Nicholas Pfluger, who was the SSPX investigator, admitting that these things happened, that it was actually a terrible thing, that Schmidberger and Filet did this. I mean, it's incontrovertible evidence, but it's amazing how when you produce this evidence, they just write it off like, oh, Church Militant said it. They were, I can't believe it. Like, okay, you don't have to believe what I say, but look at the documents. Listen to the tapes. I've put it right there for you.
How could you guys even still be doing what you're doing if what you were telling couldn't be totally corroborated? I mean, you'd be sued out of business like that.
Completely sued. Right now we are being sued for defamation by a New Hampshire priest because he was unhappy with a negative report that we put out. But we stand by every word. We're fighting it. And I believe that we're going to win this case. But we know what it's like to be sued for defamation. And I wouldn't put a single word out there that I thought wasn't 110% true. So I think there's just a great deal of blindness and resistance to wanting to read any of this. I can't tell you the number of times people just mindlessly attack me. And then I ask them, well, did you watch the report? Did you read this? Did you see this? And they're like, no, I didn't bother. I'm like, oh. It's like, how do you argue with people like that? You don't even want to look at the evidence.
Abusers, like, I just want to ask this real quick because I think this is interesting. When they have like a year of penance or whatever, and then they put them back in ministry. I mean, what is the mentality there? Like, is that like clinically proven to, sort of fix somebody and then they're not a threat anymore, or they're not likely to fall into it? I mean, how likely is an abuser to continue abusing until they're just removed from the occasion of sin, basically?
Well, what's interesting is what Bishop Filet did for 24 years with putting a predator in some remote place for a year or two of so-called prayer and penance before reinstating him to ministry is exactly what the U.S. bishops were doing for decades before it all exploded in 2002. That's exactly what they were doing for decades, like sending them off to rehab, right? St. Luke's, and then thinking they can be cured after 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever, and then putting them back in ministry. And then they abuse again, so they send them off again. It's exactly what they did. And since that time, The U.S. bishops have been called out for it, and they don't do that anymore, as far as I know. Not too much. Some of them are still doing it, but for the most part, they realize we took the wrong approach back then, because the rate of recidivism with pedophiles is extremely high, extraordinarily high. You could send them away to prison for years, and they come back, and a lot of them will reoffend. We understand that now. And so now there's more of a zero tolerance policy. At least there should be, but there's the recognition. There is not that same recognition in the SSPX. And there should be, because Fillet has the benefit of how many decades of abuse in the church. And then he knows what they did, and he knows what the U.S. bishops did and the bishops around the world did. He knows that. Right. But again, it's this clericalist attitude of, I've got to protect my priests, and I have to shield the SSPX from scandal. Right. And so therefore, I'm going to treat this very quietly, send them away quietly. Nobody's going to know why, because he would never explain why. Sometimes he would make up reasons. Like, for instance, with Father Pierre Duverger, he was caught in a sex scandal in Bordeaux, France, and immediately taken out in the middle of the school year, which is very strange. In the middle of the school year, taken out, sent to a monastery in New Mexico. And the reason that Fillet said was, he had a heart problem, had heart condition he had to deal with. Never told anybody about the sexual scandal. And then what does Duverger do in America? He abuses other women.